dad and I began our journey summiting each of the highest points of the Northeast at home with what was once considered the hardest high point in America. While Jerimoth Hill, the highest point in Rhode Island, stands at a measly 812 feet above sea level, its trail crosses through what was once privately owned land. While Brown University owned the top of the hill where their old observatory used to reside, Henry Richardson owned the surrounding land and despised the high pointers that tried reaching the top. He would use signs, security systems, and even a pellet gun to prevent eager hikers from reaching their destination. Nowadays, however, the trail and summit are owned by the state. We traveled west to the small town of Foster, Rhode Island, a mere 20 minutes from my house, to reach the trailhead. Parking on the side of the highway, we crossed Route 101 and began the debilitating third of a mile hike to bag our first peak. Upon reaching the so-called peak, we found a clearing where the observatory once stood. We signed the travel log to prove we made it and turned back down the horizontal trail to our car. The following day, we drove 3 hours to climb the Connecticut high point Mount Frissell. Arriving at the trailhead parking lot, we found the trail to be flooded with water from the previous day's rain. We did our best to stay dry, but nonetheless had wet socks and soggy boots bogging us down for the first quarter mile of our trek. Most of the hike is spent climbing up and down Mount Round, a small neighboring peak whose bald top allowed us to have our first view of our goal, Frissell. When we finally made it to the top, however, we had to withhold our celebrations. Formed 450 million years ago, Mount Frissell finds itself caught between 3 states, New York, Massachusetts, and of course Connecticut. This makes for a point of tension between Connecticut and its neighbors. For you see, the highest point of Connecticut is not at the peak of Mount Frissell, as the border between Connecticut and Massachusetts is before the peak itself. No, Connecticut is the only state that has a liner, a spot that marks the border between states as its highest point. Connecticut's highest elevation of 2,380 feet is a quarter mile down the mountain on the southern shoulder. It was only after we stood triumphantly on the small spike halfway down the mountain that we could cross another name off our list. We weren't done yet, though. We finished working our way down Frissell till we found the famous tri-point marker, the spot where one can travel through 3 states in 3 seconds. Due to the previously mentioned contentions over this tri-state intersection, Connecticut refused to help pay for the small pillar. As a result, Connecticut is absent from the pedestal. We then began to backtrack, retraversing Mount Frissell and Mount Round back to our car. Mount Greylock, the first wilderness state park in Massachusetts, established in 1898, is one of the most accessible high points in the nation. It's the source of inspiration for such works as Moby Dick and several stories by Henry David Thoreau. While most visitors drive up the winding scenic road to the summit lodge to ski or see the view, my dad and I began at the campground parking lot. We followed the 3.1-mile Hopper Trail towards the summit, crossing over the main road and even connecting with the famous Appalachian Trail. We maneuvered by fallen trees and collapsed bridges left by the previous weekend's storm. We made our way up the mountain at a fairly brisk pace until finally we saw the light at the end of the trail. Lighthouse, to be exact. The lighthouse is one of the brightest lights in all of Massachusetts, being visible for 70 miles. The tower acts both as a memorial for Massachusettsans who died during combat in World War I and as a beacon to guide pilots flying through the area at night. When we got to the top, the tower was unfortunately closed for maintenance. Nonetheless, we sat on the cusp of the mountain and ate lunch while we admired the view. At 3,491 feet, Mount Greylock, the tallest mountain in the Berkshire Range, allows you to see for miles in every direction. After signing into the summit logbook in the ski lodge, we began walking back down the mountain, concluding a perfect day's hike. Once back in our car, we drove north towards New York and our next high point. We began our hike up Mount Marcy at 7:10 in the morning after a sleepless night in the famous Adirondack Lodge. We stayed in a bunk room with 2 other men, one of whom was a loud and obnoxious snorer. The next morning we woke at dawn to prepare for the coming hike, only to find that the showers didn't function. So tired and smelly, we gathered our gear and headed towards the trailhead. Throughout the majority of our hikes, we have turned to High Point Adventures by Charlie and Diane Winger, a helpful book that tells hikers the best way to summit each high point and an assortment of facts about each mountain. One of these factoids is the predicted amount of time it will take to complete the round-trip hike. At 15 miles long with a 3,600-foot elevation gain, the book said it should take anywhere between 8 and 10 hours. Unfortunately for us, we had a 5-hour car ride waiting for us when we reached the bottom, so we made it our goal to get up and down the mountain as quickly as possible. As we rushed up the trail, it was like we were walking through history, as I thought of another individual who hurried along this same mountain. Marcy was a favorite destination for then Vice President Teddy Roosevelt, as he loved hunting and hiking on the south side of the mountain. One night, however, everything changed for him as he learned that William McKinley had been assassinated and that he would be the new president. He then rushed from his chamber and hurried back to Washington. While this all took place on the opposite side of the mountain, it was still fun to fantasize that we were walking in the footsteps of presidents. About halfway to the top, we saw our first landmark of progress. The guidebook we were using made a point of describing this tree, a tree we had looked forward to seeing for the entire week. The book went on to say, now how did those roots get around that huge rock, and how long did that take? Or is it the other way around? Contemplating this existential question, we passed the tree and continued onward to Indian Falls, and soon broke tree line. Without the cover of trees, the trail conditions changed drastically. The weather cooled and snow began to engulf the trail. We carefully walked heel to toe along the frozen path up to the final summit push. The top of the mountain was mostly roped off with a ranger on guard protecting the delicate alpine plants. When we finally made it to the top, we were met with an astounding 360-degree view. And after admiring the view, we began the 7-mile walk back to the car. Spending 20 minutes on the summit, we had to hustle down the mountain to reach our 8-hour goal. Unfortunately, in our rush, disaster struck. My dad, after miles of hiking, stubbed his toe one too many times and lost his big toenail. Despite this injury, he persisted on. Nearly breaking into a jog at the end, we rushed the final 2 miles, finishing our hike in 8 hours and 4 minutes, marking a breakneck pace of nearly 2 miles per hour for the entire 15-mile hike. Mount Katahdin, the high point of Maine, was supposed to be the highlight of our hikes. This was always one of those hikes my dad talked about wanting to do, but never could because it is 8 hours away. As such, we decided to hike to the summit of Katahdin in celebration of my dad's birthday. So after hours of driving, we pulled into the small city of Millinocket, where we met Jeff Schneerman for dinner. Upon meeting up, we went to Angela's Pizza and More, where I got myself a veggie calzone, a choice I would soon regret on the mountain. That night, we came into our campsite in Baxter State Park late and had to set up our tent in the dark. After another snore-filled night, we awoke to start our 5-mile and 4,100-foot elevation gain hike up Hunt's Trail. The first mile was fairly flat and easy as we trekked through the beautiful Maine forest. But then, we reached the infamous staircase. With too many steps to count, what was likely only half a mile felt like hundreds as we gained a lot of elevation very quickly. Once at the top of the grueling steps, however, we were met with a cathartic view of the surrounding land. We walked through the tree-covered path along the Katahdin stream and made our way through the cave. After 2 miles of fairly straightforward traditional hiking, we reached the mile of Class 3 bouldering I had been looking forward to. We used both our hands and feet to climb up and over the large rocks, being very careful not to fall and break our necks. Taking full advantage of the iron bar that had been drilled into the rock to assist us, we made our way up this dangerous section. Once we cleared the scramble, we entered the stunning plateau. This next mile felt like it was straight out of The Lord of the Rings. We walked on the flat ridge, seeing both the progress we had made and the remaining distance we had to go. Along the way, we met Greg Johnson, the executive director of the Summit Project. The project works with families of fallen soldiers of Maine, where the volunteers learn not only about the sacrifices that these service members made, but the lives that they lived. Every Memorial Day, these stones are carried up to the high point to help spread the word of these heroes' legacies. Here's Mr. Johnson's stone and story.
Today I'm carrying the stone of Marine Corps Major J.T. Obman. And Jay was killed. He was a helo pilot. He was killed on March 21st back in 2003 2 days in the Iraq conflict when they were just pushing through. We have many other stones that are here today as well.
Finally, we reached the summit where we ate lunch and met several other hikers. Katahdin marks the traditional end of the Appalachian Trail that spans from Springer Mountain, Georgia, and ends 2,190 miles away, exactly where we stood. So while several Appalachian hikers celebrated the end of their 6-month journey, I went a little lower down from the top and checked out the astounding view. On the one side, I looked out to the valley from which we came, and on the other, I saw the other trail we could have taken to the top, Knife's Edge. A dangerous path that can, at its most treacherous points, be only 1 foot wide. Then, sitting on the top of the world, I suddenly felt within me what all hikers fear most: nature's calling. Fearing what would happen if I was unable to make it down from the peak in time, I hustled down the summit stretch and nearly jogged across the plateau. Due to privacy and dead phones, the rest of the hike went unfilmed, but nonetheless, this is the story of what happened. While I was able to make it to treeline, I was unable to make it to the bottom before I could wait no longer. And while I did my business Bear Grylls style, my dad and Jeff were back at the top of the rock scramble. As they came back down the mountain, they encountered a young woman named Becca, whose group had abandoned her on the summit by accident. Scared and alone, she was frozen with fear, unable to make it down on her own. Since no one else would help her, my dad and Jeff were left with no other option but to help guide her down the trail. This included carrying her stuff and nearly carrying her down the rock scramble slowly but surely. Of course, I knew none of this as I waited for them at our campsite. So as the hours went by, I became more and more anxious. And with the sun starting to set, I grabbed some flashlights and started going back up the mountain. Half a mile up the trail, I luckily found them. I was relieved to see they were safe and proud they had helped this girl find her group. That night, after eating dinner, sharing stories, and celebrating my dad's birthday, we went back to camp, where we slept soundly after a long and eventful day. For our next trek, we made our way north to Mount Mansfield, the high point of Vermont. Along the way, we got our first flavor of the impending bad weather that we would encounter later in the week, and as a result, traffic was held up for miles. So once again, we had to set up camp in the dark. The next morning, we began to explore the beautiful Underhill State Park. The park's unique climate and elevation, especially near the summit, creates a unique biome more similar to the Arctic tundra than the surrounding Vermont environment. As such, the park is home to many delicate and rare plants, such as the tea-leaved willow, the bearberry willow, and even the endangered Diapensia laponica, just to name a few. In addition to the flora, there are many intriguing geological oddities in the park as well. For example, the Cantilever Rock, a 60-foot segment of schist rock mostly composed of quartz. Due to the constant freezing and thawing of water, the rock eventually eroded into the precarious position it finds itself in today. Moving on, we made our way up to the 4,393-foot summit. Clouds engulfed the trail and mountain, making it impossible to see further than 50 feet in front of ourselves. Nonetheless, we went from cairn to cairn, working our way up to the top. When we finally did reach the peak, the clouds began to disperse and we were met with a gorgeous view of Vermont. Making our way back down, we finally were able to appreciate not only the vistas, but the previously mentioned plants, unhindered by bad weather. As we reached the bottom of the mountain, we were finally able to pat ourselves on the back, as I just completed my 20th high point, while my dad completed his 39th. With only one high point to go, we excitedly traveled to our final and most challenging hike of all, Mount Washington. Mount Washington is truly a bear of a climb. At a colossal 6,288 feet, it stands as the tallest mountain in the Northeast. Many tourists either drive or take the train up to the summit lodge, and for good reason. The mountain has claimed the lives of 157 people since 1849 due to the mountain's extreme weather. And when I say extreme, I do mean extreme. Mount Washington recorded the fastest wind speed on the planet at 231 miles per hour in 1934. These wind speeds create low-pressure pockets around the summit, which causes exceedingly erratic weather patterns. So as we checked the forecast for the 100th time that day to make sure it was safe to climb, we began our hike up Lion's Head Trail. Where Lion's Head lacks in distance, it makes up for in prominence, as you gain a whopping 4,244 feet over the course of just 3.8 miles. The craziest part is, the first 2 miles are on fairly flat ground. So, at the end of our second mile, things became significantly more challenging as we began to break tree line. Eventually, we were able to see the namesake of the trail, the Lion's Head. We quickly scrambled up until, upon Leo's crown, we got our one and only view of the day. For as we hiked across the ridgeline to the steep Class 3 summit push, the clouds began to roll in and the weather began to change for the worse. The temperature plummeted and rime ice, frozen droplets formed from the literal thin air, began to form on the cairns that were guiding us. With the cold wind biting at our faces, we finally reached the summit. Walking up the wooden steps, I was filled with joy as I took in my frigid surroundings. We very quickly took our summit photographs and ran inside to the visitor center. Defrosting for an hour, we enjoyed a celebratory cup of coffee and asked about what the weather would be like coming back down. The news we got was concerning. We found out that a thunderstorm was to roll in within the next couple of hours. A storm that if we were caught in near the summit could mean our certain demise. With the death toll and the threat of a storm ringing in our ears, we suited up, signed the logbook, and began traveling back down the mountain. As we left, everything began to escalate extremely quickly. Snow and even hail crashed down from the heavens above and made it nearly impossible to figure out which way the trail went. The rocks that were already challenging enough to traverse coming up were made all the more difficult as they became slick from the precipitation. We were stuck in the storm for a terrifying half an hour until finally we made it back to the top of Lion's Head. Like magic, the skies began to clear, and the sun came out as we made it back to treeline. Unfortunately for us, this good fortune would be short-lived, as the thunderstorm we were warned about at last caught up to us. The previously easy first 2 miles were now a soaking last 2, as we became drenched from head to toe. This didn't faze us, though. We had done it. We had finished despite all odds all 7 of the highest points in New England. A feat we will remember for the rest of our lives. High pointing is a time-honored tradition dating back to the early 1900s that has only grown in popularity with each passing year. The pastime allows people to see vistas, floras, and faunas unlike any other. It can push people to their mental and physical limits as they explore everything nature has to offer. However, with each step one makes, an impact is made. The alpine landscape that encompasses the majority of high points in the Northeast is a delicate one. If every hiker were to walk off trail and leave their trash, it would destroy these stunning environments. As I hiked, I picked up all of the trash that I came across. In total, I disposed of pounds of garbage left by other hikers and witnessed countless others wander from the trail. While I would recommend for everyone to go out and enjoy these mountains for themselves, I cannot stress enough the importance of leaving no trace, because if one does not, these natural beauties could be lost forever.